Today, we're digging into one single historical event, but we're looking at it through two totally different lenses. It's a moment that really gets defined by one big question. The death of Joseph Smith, was it a shootout or was it a massacre? So let's set the scene. The date is June 27th, 1844. We're in a little town called Carthage, Illinois, and you can just feel the tension in the air. Because this is the day that Joseph Smith, the founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, is killed. But the how and the why of his death, well, that's at the heart of a debate that is still raging today. Okay, let's get right into it because the entire story really hinges on the power of a single word. On one side, you've got shootout. That word makes you think of a fight, right? Two sides, relatively equal, going at it. But on the other hand, you have massacre, which means the killing of defenseless people. The source material we're looking at today makes the case that which word you choose completely changes the story. So let's start by taking apart that shootout claim. According to our source, this whole idea falls apart when you look at the massive imbalance of power. First up, the attackers, the mob that swarmed the Carthage jail. Look, this wasn't just a handful of angry guys. We are talking about something like 150 armed men. Now let's look at who was inside the room they were storming. Just 4 men. Joseph Smith, his brother Hiram Smith, John Taylor, and Willard Richards. That's it. And what did they have to defend themselves? What was their arsenal? Just one small pistol that someone had snuck into them earlier. When you see the numbers like this, the difference is it's staggering. 150 attackers versus 4 men. The source basically argues that calling this a shootout is just not honest. It ignores the overwhelming force, and really it tries to reframe what was essentially a lynching as some kind of fair fight. And this huge imbalance of power leads us directly into the next piece of the puzzle, which is more of a theological one. It's the debate over martyrdom. The big question is, if you defend yourself, does that automatically disqualify you from being called a martyr? Now, to really get this, we have to look at the standard that critics often use. The traditional idea of a Christian martyr is someone who dies for their beliefs without fighting back, following the example of Christ's submission. But the Latter-day Saint view is grounded in their own scripture. This passage from their Doctrine and Covenants could not be clearer. It explicitly frames Joseph Smith's death as a martyrdom, saying he sealed his testimony with his blood. So how do they square that circle of armed defense and martyrdom? Well, the source lays out a few key arguments. First, the mob's whole reason for being there was to kill him for his religious claims. Second, he was defending, not attacking. Third, and this is a big one, their theology actually values righteous self-defense. And finally, there's this incredibly powerful human element. He only fired that pistol after he watched his own brother get murdered right in front of him. And this all leads us to what is really the core argument in our source material today. This idea that critics of Joseph Smith are using a unique and frankly inconsistent set of double standards. The source challenges the critics' whole premise by asking this central question. If a person dies a violent death, does that automatically prove they were a false prophet? And to really hammer this point home, the source makes a pretty bold parallel, a direct comparison to Jesus Christ. Think about it. The claims, both said they had divine authority. The actions, both challenged the religious leaders of their day. The outcome, both provoked the authorities and were ultimately killed. The argument here is, if you're going to say Joseph Smith provoked his own death, couldn't you apply that same logic to the crucifixion? Okay, so let's shift gears a little. The source doesn't just look at the arguments, it actually turns the spotlight on the messenger pushing this shootout story, a well-known critic named Bill McKeever. The source brings up the critic's own words. See, McKeever publicly says he's a friend to Latter-day Saints, and that he has a fondness for them. But the source material really questions this, asking, is this actual friendship? Or is it more like the tactic of a wolf in sheep's clothing? Someone who seems friendly on the outside, but their real intent is hostile. And then it starts unpacking this by asking some pretty pointed questions, like why dedicate your entire life's work to tearing down one specific Christ-focused church instead of, say, atheistic movements? Is his income directly tied to his anti-LDS work? It also points out that McKeever himself said he had positive experiences with members of the church before he got into all the critical material. And finally, it argues that using loaded words like cult, well, that's a tactic to shut down conversation, not to encourage it. And this really brings us to our final thought for today, and it's a big one. It just leaves you wondering, how much of any historical event is just the raw facts of what happened, and how much of it is the story we choose to build around those facts? The words we choose, shootout or massacre, they don't just describe our history. In a very real way, they create it.